Hi everyone, my name is Curtis Mitch and I'm with the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology, and welcome back to another one of our weekday reflections on the daily Mass readings. Today's a special day. Today is the feast day of St. Matthew the Evangelist, and so the gospel that's selected today is the call of St. Matthew that appears especially in the Gospel of Matthew, in Matthew chapter 9, verses 9 all the way to 13. Now in today's gospel, we have the call of St. Matthew, and it's a story of radical conversion, of Jesus calling a man, and his response is immediate and profound. He stands up from doing what he's doing, and he follows Jesus from that point forward. And so far as we know, he never even goes back to the job that he left on that very day, because Jesus had a mission for him, and he gave him an abundance of grace to fulfill that mission. Now, we might classify today's reading as something of a moral miracle, all right? We see Jesus in the Gospels. We see various nature miracles. We see Jesus calming the wind and the waves with his word. We see Jesus multiplying loaves and fish for the hungry multitudes on the hillsides of Galilee. We also see these other types of miracles where Jesus heals the sick, where Jesus casts out demons, and they heed his word, and they depart from the person that they've been harassing, oppressing, and so forth. But here we have another kind of miracle, and in a way, it's a more remarkable miracle, that Jesus would call a sinful human person who is intrinsically, at least in our fallen state, intrinsically selfish and self-interested and unwilling, only grudgingly able to give himself to other people. And then the powerful word of Christ goes forth, and he drops everything and he follows the Master. That there's something there. There's a miracle that takes place in the heart of the human person that's even more remarkable than commanding demons or calming the wind during a storm. All right? It's a call, we should remind ourselves, that comes with the grace of God to respond. All right? God calls us to things as Christians. He calls us to things that we don't have the power, we don't have the wherewithal to actually do. And so, in addition to his call, he has to give us the grace to do it. He has to give us that inward strength, that ability to do by grace what we could never do by nature. And that's very much in the background of the call of St. Matthew in today's reading. So let's look at the text and then let's discuss a little bit about St. Matthew, who this figure is, and what lessons this text has for us today. We begin in Matthew chapter 9, verse 9. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax office. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. And as he sat at table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and sat down with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he heard it, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." So today's gospel is all about the call of Jesus. That call goes out to Matthew, and that call goes out to sinners, all sinners, summoning them to repentance and to bring them closer to God and into the family of God. But what do we know about this first individual, all right, this tax collector who is named Matthew? Well, Matthew, we know, is called in this episode to be a disciple. But if we were to read on in the Gospel of Matthew, we would see in the very next chapter, in Matthew 10, that Matthew is selected from this larger pool of disciples and actually called to be one of the 12. He is handpicked, selected by Jesus to be one of his apostles. So he's not just one who would then follow Jesus, he is one who will be sent forth by Jesus with the good news after the Paschal mystery is accomplished, the death and resurrection of our Lord. So Matthew is one of those apostles, all right? The last time we hear of Matthew, for example, in the New Testament is when he's gathered together with the apostles in the upper room in Acts chapter 1 for the Feast of Pentecost. On the birthday of the church, Matthew is there. The Spirit comes mightily upon him as it comes upon the 12 and all the others who are gathered in the upper room. Now, Matthew tells us here in verse 9 that he was sitting at the tax office. Now, what does that mean? It means that Matthew himself was a tax collector or a publican. That probably means, we don't have certainty on all the details of this, but it probably means that Matthew was a customs official in Galilee, okay? So he probably taxed the importing of goods from other places outside of Galilee and probably taxed the export of things like fish from Galilee to other places. Now, tax collectors were generally despised by devout Jews, certainly by the scribes and Pharisees. Why would that be so? Because they were seen as collaborators of the evil Roman power, right? The land of Israel is under the yoke of Roman rule in the first century. And the taxes that would be collected, or the customs that would be collected on goods that were sold, would be given to Herod Antipas, who was the Tetrarch of Galilee at that time. And Herod Antipas was not only a kind of disgraceful human person, barely Jewish in his observances, but more or less lived like a pagan. He was also put in power by the Romans. He was also a puppet of Roman power in the land of Israel. And so tax collectors were despised as collaborating with the enemy. On the other hand, there's also the fact that tax collectors tended to be dishonest. Maybe all of them weren't, but we know many of them probably were, right? That if you were asked to collect a certain tax on a certain good that is sold, such as a basket of fish or whatever, they would just add a little bit extra to the amount that was taxed, and then they would pocket the profits, all right? So they tended to be dishonest and greedy, or at least they had a reputation for being that, all right? So a tax collector was not someone that most Jews would think was engaged in a respectable profession at all right? They were despised. Now, a curious thing, in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 9, verse 9, we are told that Matthew was sitting at the tax office. But if you look at the parallel passages in the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Luke, the individual sitting at the tax office is named not Matthew, but Levi. All right, and that raises a question. Who is this Levi? Is it Matthew or is it Levi? Are they two different people or are they one person? Well, they seem to be very clearly one and the same person. And the question is, why does this person have two different names? Well, believe it or not, it's actually not that uncommon in the ancient Jewish world to have more than one name. As a matter of fact, in the book of Acts chapter 1, we learn of a man who has a Roman Latin name, a Hebrew name, and an Aramaic name. He actually had three, all right? So it's not uncommon, but what's going on here? Well, some scholars have speculated that possibly Levi is Matthew's tribal name. In other words, he's a Levite. He's from the tribe of Levi, Levi being one of the 12 tribes of Israel. That's possible. It's not certain, and I'm not sure that it's all that likely. I tend to prefer the view, and it's not certain, but it's just a preference of mine, that in fact Matthew is Levi's Christian name, that Levi is his given name, but he was given the name Matthew, kind of like Peter, who was Simon, was called the Rock, or Petros, or Peter. He was given a new name to signify something about his new Christian vocation. All right? The brothers, James and John, were called by Jesus the sons of thunder. Okay? They were given a title in addition to their given name. What we might have here is a man named Levi, brought up Levi from birth, but Jesus at some point had renamed him Mattatyahu, which is a Hebrew expression that means gift of the Lord or gift of Yahweh. Okay, so this might be Matthew's Christian name, and it tells us something about him, that God views Matthew as a gift, and he's giving Matthew as a gift to others as well, as we'll see. So that's one possibility, that Matthew was actually the Christian name of a man who was originally called Levi. Now, the most important thing about Matthew the thing that probably most of us are already familiar with, is the fact that the first gospel, the flagship of the New Testament, is called the Gospel of Matthew. And in fact, every ancient manuscript of the first gospel that preserves the title page has some variation of the title kata Matthaion, according to Matthew. Either it's the Gospel of Matthew, or the Holy Gospel of Matthew, or simply according to Matthew. All right? It's a universal tradition in ancient Christianity that this disciple, this man who was a tax official, who was called by Jesus and responded immediately to Jesus, wrote the first book of the New Testament. In fact, the universal tradition is actually, there are several parts to it. It's universally agreed in ancient Christian sources that Matthew was the first person to write a gospel. All right, that's why he was given in the canon that first slot before Mark, Luke, and John, because it was believed that those three evangelists actually wrote after Matthew had written. The second thing is that the Gospel of Matthew was thought to be written to Jewish Christians in Judea, or in the land of Israel more widely, possibly including Galilee and other places, Caesarea and other places like that, or possibly Syria up north. But in any case, the point is that Matthew had written the first gospel, the first account of the life of Jesus. He had written it for fellow Jewish Christians living in the land of Israel. And if we had time, we'd go through and show all of the various signs of where Matthew shows himself to be addressing the life of Jesus to the concerns of the Jewish people, all right, to show that Jesus is in fact the Jewish and Davidic Messiah of ancient expectation. All right, so there's a third part as well. The tradition states that the first gospel was written in Hebrew. Okay, it survives in Greek, but the universal tradition is that Matthew wrote it in Hebrew. As a matter of fact, St. Jerome in the 4th century claims to have seen copies of the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew in the library of Caesarea, all right, on the coast of Palestine. It's not certain how the gospel went from Hebrew into Greek, into the canonical form of the book that we have translated in our Bibles today. In fact, St. Jerome says we're not sure. It could have been Matthew, it could have been someone else who rendered it in Greek. But the idea is that the gospel was first written in Hebrew for the Hebrews living in the land of Israel. Now, this universal tradition is an undisputed tradition. Okay, it's been documented at least for the first 9 centuries of Christian history. There is not a single naysayer. There is no one who raised their voice in the ancient church and said, no, that wasn't written by the Apostle Matthew. That was written by someone else. There is simply no disagreement on this point anywhere in the sources that survive. Now, what's most remarkable is that this universal tradition, which is an undisputed tradition, is also a somewhat unlikely tradition. And here's what I mean by that. If you look at the New Testament, Matthew is not a prominent figure. We don't hear anything that Matthew says in the New Testament. We don't have any dialogues with Jesus. We don't have any additional events beyond his call where we actually see him doing or saying something. We simply have him present. He's listed among the 12 apostles and he's there in the upper room on Pentecost, but we don't have any episodes about him. So Matthew was not a prominent figure in early Christianity. In fact, we can take one step beyond that. It is most unlikely that the earliest Christians would attribute the very first gospel to a man who was a tax collector, right? In other words, the earliest Jewish Christian community generally did not have a high view of tax collectors. So why on God's green earth would you attribute the first gospel to a tax collector named Matthew? There's only one reason: because it's true, because it's historical. There are no good reasons beyond the fact of the church's solid historical tradition to attribute this gospel to Matthew, and yet every ancient Christian who speaks on the subject does precisely that. All right, he is the first evangelist. And it's even more significant when you consider that the Gospel of Matthew was the most widely diffused gospel in earliest Christianity. All the way through the 2nd century into the 3rd, most quotations from the Gospels, either the words of Jesus or the deeds of Jesus that are quoted in the earliest church fathers, the great majority are quotations from the Gospel of Matthew. It was quite simply the favorite gospel of the ancient church. All right, you might say that there was a primacy of honor accorded to the Gospel of Matthew. All right, that's how important it was. It was perhaps the most important document of the earliest days of the church. Now, what's the lesson that we would gain from today's gospel in this conversion story of Matthew, who hears the voice of Jesus and responds immediately? Today's gospel tells us what Jesus has come for. If we simply ask the question, why did Jesus come? Jesus himself tells us in the very last verse of today's reading in Matthew 9:13, "For I came not to call the righteous, but to call sinners." Jesus has come to save tax collectors and sinners. He has come to seek and to save the lost. And you will notice there's a reason why Matthew connects this episode in the house when Jesus and the disciples are reclining at table, why he connects that to the story of his own conversion, because it's in this story that the Pharisees complain, why does Jesus eat with tax collectors and sinners? You see, tax collectors and sinners all belong together in one category. From the devout Jewish perspective, tax collectors and sinners were like two ways of saying the same thing. And yet this is precisely those whom Jesus has come to save. Now, if we were to put this into a modern context and kind of plug in, who are the tax collectors and sinners that we might look out upon the world and judge today? We might think of drug runners. We might think of criminals or prostitutes or people who work in the pornography industry or in human trafficking. We need to remind ourselves that it is precisely those people that Jesus has come to save. The gospel is for them. It is not for the righteous. In fact, we should recall beyond that we ourselves were in the category of the tax collectors and the sinners, because the church teaches us that we were born in a state of sin. Original sin means that we are born into the world alienated from the one true God. So literally every one of us is a sinner, was a sinner, and continues to sin until the day of their death. All right, and so we don't have the right to stand looking down upon others and judging them and slamming down the gavel and condemning them before God, because we were all condemned before God until Jesus came to save the tax collector and the sinner, until Jesus came to save me and you. So I think the thing we need to do is to thank God for the grace of conversion. Thank God for the call that went forth from Jesus that roused us from our slumber, that called us out of the darkness into his wonderful light. Because that's what it is. It's an act of God's grace. It's a moral miracle that God performs in our life and wants to continue to perform in the life of everyone around you. I mean, that's the gospel message. So we need to thank God for that gift of grace to respond, because if we didn't have that grace, we couldn't respond and wouldn't respond to the call of Jesus. But with that grace, like St. Matthew, we respond. And so we thank God for that, and we need to pray that God would give that gift to others, that others who are in darkness, others who are working even now as tax collectors, that the voice of Jesus will go forth powerfully and summon them into the kingdom of God. I pray that these reflections were of some help to you today. Pray that God blesses you, your family, and your day, and happy feast day of St. Matthew the Evangelist.